Canada is unequivocal in our condemnation of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on the sovereign, democratic state of Ukraine.
Tonight, Russia invades Ukraine.
From what we gather, she was maybe by herself there for 4 or 5 hours.
The family of a woman who froze to death in the middle of a town wants to know what happened.
A child that's a mile from where they're supposed to be. And so now our evidence is taking us to a totally different location.
And a radar search of an old residential school site raises more questions than answers. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. We begin with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is being harshly condemned by the West and raising fears this is only the beginning of Vladimir Putin's plan to invade other countries and expand Russian power and territory. Sirens sounded in the capital, Kyiv, throughout the day. Russian troops attacked from the north, south, and east by air and on the ground, sending bombs ripping through Ukraine, taking out its air defenses and hitting military installations. Ukraine's president has declared martial law and is calling on Russia to return to peace, calling on the world for help. There are reports of both military and civilian casualties, and that Russian troops have taken control of the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear plant in the fighting.
Are you frightened? Are you scared?
Sure. We just bring our necessary stuffs. I have nothing.
You have nothing?
Yeah, I have just passport documents and some money.
Many frightened Ukrainians are seeking shelter underground in subway stations and bomb shelters. Families, including young children and pets, all huddling together, not sure what they should do next. Many civilians, including school children, were given training drills on where to go in case of a bombing. It's also clear that some Russians are totally against what Putin has done. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, thousands of people have been out in the streets in anti-war protests, and hundreds of them have been arrested by police. Russian authorities have warned citizens against taking part in anti-invasion protests. Russia's so-called investigative committee issued an alert for people to refrain from holding, quote, unauthorized actions and participating in uncoordinated events. The United States has announced another round of sanctions in response to Vladimir Putin's attack against Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden, in his first address since the attack, says the sanctions will hurt both now and in the long term.
Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It will strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions.
And thanks to our CTV partners for that coverage. Here at home, Canada is condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At a Thursday press conference, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau outlined some of the sanctions the Kremlin will now face. Here's our Fraser Needham with more.
The Prime Minister did not mince his words. Justin Trudeau says Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an attack on Canada, the world, and democracy itself.
Canada is unequivocal in our condemnation of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on the sovereign, democratic state of Ukraine. President Putin's brazen disregard for international law democracy, and human life are a massive threat to security and peace around the world.
After mobilizing on the Ukrainian border for weeks, Russian troops moved into the country early Thursday. In response, Trudeau says Canada will be imposing a number of economic penalties.
These sanctions will target 58 individuals and entities, including members of the Russian elite and their family members, as well as the Wagner Group and major Russian banks, among others. We will also sanction members of the Russian Security Council, including the Defense Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Justice Minister. In addition, effective immediately, we are ceasing all export permits for Russia and cancelling existing permits.
The Prime Minister would not specify if or when Canada would send troops into the conflict. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
We want to hear what you think about what's unfolding in Ukraine. Here's how you can get in touch. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca or leave a comment on aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. In other news, Quebec got served today. 3 government ministries are named in a formal legal notice issued by the Atikamekw community of Wimotache, who say their ancestral lands are being destroyed by logging. Here's Lindsay Richardson with more.
Unconstitutional, self-serving, and superficial. These are a few of the terms tossed around by the Atikamekw Nation to describe the clear-cutting and logging activities on their ancestral territory. And on Thursday, one community took legal steps to try and force a delay. The Atikamekw community of Wimotache held a presser to announce they've served 3 government ministries with a formal notice to suspend logging activities on their lands. A lawyer representing the community says it's an invitation to renegotiate, and if ignored by Quebec, could lead to a major lawsuit. Wimotache says they're not against industry and are not taking aim at logging companies because they don't want to compromise future partnerships. But if the government doesn't hold to their promise and their duty to consult, Wimotache and its surrounding sister communities say their Atikamekw traditions and way of life will be compromised. Because this was a late afternoon press conference, the 3 ministries named in the formal notice have not had time to respond on the record, but we'll have more on that as well as what's at stake coming up tomorrow. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Trois-Rivières, Quebec.
To the prairies now, and the family of a woman found dead outside of a home in the Pas, Manitoba, is searching for answers. Our Daryl Stranger has more.
Family say 31-year-old Ashley Kematch was a mother and daycare worker.
She was a very outgoing girl, and she was very kind, respectful, and she had lots of friends that really cared and loved her.
She had been out with friends during the Trappers Festival in the Pas. RCMP say she was not dressed for the extreme cold that night. Her body was discovered outside a home Monday morning. According to RCMP, Kematch had been at the house where her body was found earlier in the evening, but left with an unknown man. Officers have since located and spoken to him. It's believed she died of exposure, and RCMP have said they don't suspect foul play. Ashley's grandmother and aunt have questions about how she could be left alone for hours in -30 weather.
There's so many unanswered questions, like where was everybody? Why didn't anybody see her? Like, from what we gather, she was maybe by herself there for like 4 or 5 hours.
Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The Battlefords Tribal Council in Saskatchewan is expanding its search for graves connected to the St. Andre Indian Residential School near the town of Delmas. An initial search didn't turn up any graves, but records show 44 children died at the school, and survivors say there are indeed graves waiting to be found. APTN's Leon Saunders has more.
The only grave that's been found so far was that of Henry Atchinham. He was 14 when he died in 1910. His gravestone was found by a farmer 1 kilometer away from the ground-penetrating radar search conducted last year. Neil Sasakamus is the executive director of the Battlefords Agency Tribal Chiefs.
A child that's a mile from where they're supposed to be. And so now our evidence is taking us to a totally different location. So the search grid for Delmas isn't an immediate area anymore. It's going out to the Saskatchewan River.
Sasakamus says elders and residents in the area say that children's graves were moved, possibly twice.
Some might have been moved together, like say if they were in that area where they're building the Yellowhead Highway, there might have been movement there. There might have been movement just inside of the town of Delmas, but there's residences now there on top of on what they think. There's some of them are underneath residences. We don't know. It's really a sad story.
The radar search is set to resume this spring. Sasakamus says it's incredibly challenging trying to get landowner approval and also trying to pinpoint where to look.
And when you start doing search grids in 2 miles and based on older history, I don't want to say they're needles in a haystack, but it's very difficult to find where those kids are.
Once the Delmas search is completed, the Battleford Agency will shift their focus to the Battleford Industrial School. That school was operated on the site of the former Territorial Government House in Battleford by the Anglican Church and later the Diocese of Saskatchewan. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A string of Indigenous identity scandals hit the arts world last year, including Michelle Latimer's claims of being Indigenous, which came under scrutiny when she couldn't name precisely what community she comes from. APTN and the Indigenous Screen Office have now taken action so that funding grants meant for First Nations, Métis or Inuit don't go to non-Indigenous people.
It's sort of
The
is coming out.
ISO and APTN released a report called Building Trust and Accountability. It suggests several ways funding agencies can weed out false claims of Indigenous identity. Jesse Wente, the co-executive producer of ISO, encourages all funders to read the 60-page report.
Right relations require trust and accountability, and all arts funding relies on a fundamental trust between storyteller and funding body. This report will act as a guide for all parties in how we ensure and move in right relationship. We encourage everyone to read it and to sit with it, so we may continue this work with full consideration and care.
And you can find much more on that report over on our website, aptnnews.ca. Time for a quick break. Still to come, we'll take you to a military operation happening in the NWT.
And if we look through history, the Indigenous peoples have always helped out our military, and they continue to do so.
Welcome back. The federal government has announced $80 million in funding for housing in northern and remote communities. The money will be used to ease the high cost of materials and skilled labor. All types of housing are eligible for funding, like temporary or transitional housing. The funding is intended for groups like Indigenous governments and nonprofits. It's part of the federal government's Housing Supply Challenge program.
The investments we're announcing today, made possible through the National Housing Strategy, will lead to solutions that will break down these barriers. Everyone in Canada deserves a place to call home that they can afford and that meets their needs.
Nunavut's chronic nursing shortage and the stress COVID-19 has put on frontline staff have combined to close the only healthcare facility in one isolated community. Nunavut's Health Minister John Main announced this week that the health centre in Igloolik will be closed until January 28th because of the staff having to isolate from COVID-19 exposure. Igloolik is close to 900 kilometers northwest of Iqaluit and is home to almost 1,700 people. There are currently 29 known active cases of COVID-19 in Igloolik. There are staff on site for emergency life-saving care, but everything else is being run online or over the phone. Airlines all over Canada are announcing new routes this spring with an eye toward a more normal summer for tourism. And for Nunavut, that means a brand new way to get south. Canadian North Airline announced that they will be providing a direct flight from Iqaluit to Toronto twice a week, beginning in June and running until September. This is the first time a direct commercial flight between the two cities has ever been in place. So how much will a return flight from Iqaluit to Toronto cost? According to the Canadian North ticket website, just under $900, basically the same rate as Iqaluit to Ottawa. Cheaper than Winnipeg. A long-running military operation is in full swing along the Beaufort Sea in the Northwest Territories. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs brings us all the action in the sky, under the water, and on the land.
This cold weather operators course is the first of its kind in the Arctic for regular and reserve force members, many of whom work, train, and operate nowhere near here.
Okay, left over right, right over left.
And they're learning from the best.
Sling over.
CWO Joel Pedersen is the only First Nations Chief Warrant Officer in the entire Canadian Armed Forces.
Kind of when you get to my rank, you don't get the opportunity to do this, to share with young soldiers. Where they're going to be operating is where we were last night, sleeping outside in the -40 with wind chill, and they may have to get up, put on their snowshoes, and be prepared to do their job, which is being out on the land.
More than 200 Canadian Armed Forces personnel are in the small Inuvialuit communities of Tuktoyaktuk and Nunavut.
Good evening, sir. Captain Fisher.
Participating in Operation Nanook, Nunavut. For 2 weeks, CAF will conduct activities such as long-range patrols and complex logistical supports to demonstrate their ability to sustain forces in the Arctic. They'll work with armed forces from the US, the UK, and even divers from France. At the Commander's Update Brief, we meet important figures, like the Padre.
I've been going around since we came, trying to see where they are. And
Captain Augustine Esnerit, a spiritual advisor who looks after the group's emotional and mental well-being.
If somebody needs an urgent attention, then I go direct to the CO, to the commanding officer, and say, hey, we have to pay attention to this soldier.
The Padre has lived and worked in Saugeen First Nation for 15 years.
That gave me an opportunity to educate people who haven't been, in the community. And it's very unfortunate that so many people, they only see the town, they don't see the people and who they are. They are people with wonderful, open hearts, so welcoming, so generous and down to earth.
So for Ranger 1, they've had a pretty hard time going up. They're facing some pretty nasty weather right now.
The success of the operation is also reliant on joint patrols with the Canadian Rangers.
and they've learned the skills and the knowledge that's been passed on the same way it has been passed on through Indigenous culture and land and that aspect. So again, if we look through history, the Indigenous peoples have always helped out our military, and they continue to do so.
Pedersen, a member of Fond du Lac Dene First Nation and Mikisew Cree First Nation, says he's also learning from locals.
We're going to be going out for a night move, so we're going to pack up our tent, and they're going to put their snowshoes on and their rucksacks, and we're going to go for about a 10K walk, and then we're going to set up a tent. We've already talked to the ranger. We've asked him, what do you think the best place is?
Operation Nanook wraps up February 28. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Tuktarak.
Thanks, Charlotte. Time for another quick break. Coming up, we'll take a look at tonight's episode of Nation to Nation. Welcome back. Time now for our photo of the day. Two of APTN's family members are now back home after taking time away to work on the Winter Olympics in Beijing, China. We want to welcome home both Simone Charland from our Vancouver Bureau and Annie Moljeski from our home base in Winnipeg, Manitoba. You can send your photos to share@aptn.ca for the chance to be our next photo of the day. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 7 below with snow in Halifax, -4 in St. John's. -22 with sunny skies in Nain, 20 below for Happy Valley Goose Bay. -11 with snow in Montreal, 14 below in Chibougamau. -9 and flurries in Sault Ste. Marie, 8 below in North Bay. -9 and sunny in Thunder Bay, 12 below with the sun out in Sioux Lookout. -14 with snow for God's Lake, 13 below and snow in Norway House, 12 below in Winnipeg, -9 in Dauphin. -10 for Regina, 7 below in Saskatoon, -7 in Meadow Lake and La Ronge. Over in northern Alberta, +2 in Grand Prairie, -3 in Fort McMurray. -3 in Medicine Hat, +1 and sunny in Lethbridge. +6 under the sun for Vancouver, 5 above in Victoria. -2 in Prince George, 1 below in Smithers. -12 in Old Crow, -2 with snow in Whitehorse. -22 in Yellowknife, 11 below in Norman Wells. -21 in Sax Harbor, 24 below for Paulatuck. -23 and snow in Baker Lake, 28 below with snow in Cambridge Bay. -24 in Resolute, 33 below in Igloolik. It's another packed episode of Nation to Nation coming up in a matter of moments. Here's host Brett Forrester to tell us what's on the show tonight.
Thanks, Winnipeg. The 2020 lobster dispute in Nova Scotia may have faded from headlines, but the fallout hasn't. Last year, advocates and lawyers wrote to the United Nations to get the UN to ask Canada why it failed to protect Mi'kmaq harvesters from racially motivated violence. Canada has its answer written, but won't release it yet. A Mi'kmaq lawyer wants to know why. As well, dozens of commercial fishers ransacked a lobster pound back then. They avoided going to trial by opting for restorative justice. That doesn't sit well with one Mi'kmaq chief. And I speak to a chief from Quebec where earlier this month the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal made a ruling that Canada is discriminating against a First Nations police force by chronically underfunding it. That's all coming up right after the news. I'll see you then.
Thanks, Brett. Packed show indeed. You can catch the entire episode of Nation to Nation with Brett Forrester in just a few minutes' time. That is all the time we have for your APTN National News for this Thursday. For much more, you can head over to our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for being with us. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.